Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream Future Vibe podcast. Today I'm joined by Christopher Lawson, author of the book Reconstructing Jesus. How are you, Chris?
I'm well. How are you, Jacob?
I'm doing well, thank you very much. Well, welcome back to the show, Chris. So when you look at Jesus and you compare him to the to Judas the Galilean ideologically, and you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, what led you to the conclusion that Jesus was related to Judas the Galilean, like his biological son?
Uh, Basically, the one theme of the New Testament that is most consistent above all other themes, and that is the theme of royalty. Jesus was preaching a coming kingdom. He was the Messiah. The Messiah is a king. He was the King of the Jews. The trial of Jesus in Mark in 15 verses. In 6 verses. It's 15 verses, right? It says King of the Jews 6 times when discussing the trial of Jesus. The birth stories all say the king is born. Uh, Everything about the New Testament yells, this guy claimed to be the heir to the throne. He claimed to be the messianic king, or people made the claim for him. You can look at that either way. I personally think he made the claim himself, and others made the claim for him. So if that is a historically accurate representation of what Jesus was preaching, then I think that we need to ask ourselves, who is he related to? Because the only way you can be king is to be the son of the previous king. That's how kings work. You go to England, they have a monarchy. There's no question about that Charles was going to be the king. We knew that Charles would be the king while Queen Elizabeth was still reigning. We knew who the next guy would be. There was no question about it. There was no, oh, what shall we do? The queen's gone. Who's the ruler? No stress. Everybody knows. I think the same thing would have to be said for Jesus if he was a legitimate claimant as a messianic king. We don't hear people saying, we can't accept you as messianic king because you're not the son of the previous king. You don't hear anybody saying that. Therefore, he must have been the son of the previous king. So now all we have to do is identify who was the previous king, at least according to the sect that seems to be the one most tied to Jesus. The sect most tied to Jesus, in my opinion, is the Dead Sea Scroll sectarians. The reasons I make those links are a long list of things. A sacred meal of bread and wine. They had an inner council of three. They had a council of 12, an inner circle of three. Sacred meal, talking about the Holy Spirit, speaking about parables. One thing after another completely matches the Dead Sea. The scrolls teachings completely match the same themes and ideas that are brought up in Jesus' preaching. And who did they have as their previous king? We just have to say, who was the Dead Sea Scrolls claimant for king a generation before Jesus? And if Jesus is a legitimate claimant, then he would be the son of that person. Now, I thought we were actually going to be doing this video and discussing about carbon 14 and the dating of the scrolls.
Yeah,
so
I was going to get to that. I just wanted to recap slightly on our previous videos for those that didn't listen.
Okay. So basically, it's the king theme that says to me that Jesus had to be related to Judah the Galilean because Judah the Galilean had royal pretensions according to Josephus, and he clearly was tied to the Dead Sea Scroll sect. If you look at the teachings of Judah the Galilean as represented in Antiquities and Wars by Josephus and compare them to the Scrolls teachings, you'll find that they're a perfect match. So I think the Dead Sea Scroll sect is the sect founded by Judah the Galilean, and hence I make the link there. Now, part of the making of that link means they have to match time-wise, and that brings us around That's a segue to the carbon-14 analysis of Dead Sea Scrolls. Carbon-14 is a poor way to do analysis for the dating of the scrolls because it's too vague. It's like somebody asking you when you were born, and you say in the 19th century, and that's it. That's your birthday, 19th century. Early or 20th century. My birthday is I'm born in the 20th century. Well, that's way too vague to be helpful. But that's about the only accuracy you're going to get of carbon-14 dating on that. And part of it has to do with you're measuring a very, very small quantity of a material, and you've got several factors that you have to deal with. One is errors in the readings. So you say it's how many units of carbon in the sample, plus or minus so much. Well, that plus or minus so much means that the final age is going to be plus or minus so much. Another big problem is that carbon-14 is based upon a lot of assumptions that we know are not completely regular. They're reliable assumptions, but they are not consistent. We know that carbon-14 is produced in the upper atmosphere from cosmic rays bombarding nitrogen. We know that's consistent. It will be doing that. But the rate that it does it at is not consistent. We don't know how it's varied over time. We do know that we've had to adjust carbon-14 dates to match calendrical dates by doing an adjustment. They have to be compensated. Basically, they've done tree ring data analysis where they've been able to say, okay, this tree goes back this far, and then it starts to overlap with this other tree in the woods beside that's a little older than that, and it carries back the dating to here, and then it overlaps with another tree over here, and that overlaps, and you have lots and lots of trees in the woods, so and in the fossil record, so you're getting all these multiple overlaps in the tree ring data till you can go back further and further and further in time. And you say, okay, now we've gotten back to this tree, and we know from the tree ring data that it is such and such a date, but the carbon-14 gives us a different date. And we know what the date is from the tree rings. So I say, okay, the carbon-14 date needs to be calibrated. And you can look up carbon-14 calibration on the internet. You find out that it always has to be calibrated. So they have fancy charts, calibration curves that say, well, we figure the cosmic ray radiation has varied from one century to another, one decade to another. And if it looks like the date's over here on the graph, the calibration curve says, oh, it's got to be up by this much adjusted. So you've already got the calibrations that you've got to do. And carbon-14 analysis is very, very sensitive to having these corrections made. They expect them to be made, that it's not automatically an exact date. Furthermore, carbon-14 gives you an age range. So it'll tell you the date is between this point and that point, and it's going to be 2/3 chance that it's between that range, and that will be the first sigma distribution of the range that carbon-14 gives you. Then they say, if you want to be a little more sure, there's a wider range that they call the second sigma distribution, which has a 95% chance that the accurate date will be in there. And even in the second sigma distribution of ranges of dates, they admit that 1 out of 20 times, 5% of the time, the actual date may be older or younger than the date that the carbon-14 date is giving you. Then there's another factor that we simply have no way of adjusting for or correcting for that can mess us up. And that is leaching or contamination of the samples. So, for example, you might have a manuscript that is 1,000 years old. You're going to carbon-14 date it, but the manuscript has gotten moldy, and the mold is new growth. And it makes the manuscript look younger because the mold on it is new life. And it's got the modern carbon-14 ratios in it. And so when you add the mold in with the sample of the manuscript and you burn it all up and measure how much carbon in the carbon, how much is 12, how much is carbon-14, the new stuff is going to have far less of the carbon-12. It's going to have more of the carbon-14 in it that hasn't broken down yet and make it look newer. So you can have contamination that makes a sample look newer, or you can have contamination that makes the sample look older. And this is the thing that's most concerning when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they were stored in an area that is surrounded 100% in every direction, surrounded by a contamination source for carbon. It's found in marl. Marl is limestone, but not only is it limestone, it's the softest limestone, or one of the softest. You can cut it by hand. And so a lot of the caves, the Dead Sea Scroll caves, were actually hand-carved caves, not just natural caves, but man-made caves, because the limestone was so soft. You need a cave, you can make one there, no problem. And they did so. In fact, let's just go through. 10 of the scroll-bearing caves were hand-cut into this soft marl. Hand-cut into it. That's cave 4QA, 4QB, cave 5Q, cave 7Q, cave 8Q, cave 9Q, and cave 10Q. There's also an oval cave to the west of 5Q, and there's 2 more caves in a separate ravine to the north that were also hand-carved in the marl. Now, marl is a type of limestone. Limestone is calcium carbonate. Carbon, but it's not new carbon. It's 500 million years old carbon. That's very little carbon-14 in it, in fact, virtually none anymore. There's no carbon-14 left in the calcium carbonate. And you've got the scrolls, and if you look at the floor that the scroll is lying on, it's calcium carbonate. You look at the walls on each side, to the left, calcium carbonate, to the right, calcium carbonate, forward, calcium carbonate, behind it, calcium carbonate, above it, calcium carbonate, below it, calcium carbonate. It's surrounded by calcium carbonate that is millions of years old, has very little carbon-14. It only takes traces, smallest traces of infiltration of any of that carbon into the scroll to add hundreds of years age to the scroll, making it look older. Just traces of the million-year-old carbon will make it look hundreds of years old, just by traces. So that means you can't trust the carbon-14 dating of the scrolls because it's giving you a false date. Not that the scientists are trying to fool you. They want the truth. But they find the truth by using scientific method. And the scientific method means you must know what's involved at every stage of the experiment, that you're in control of it. And we're not. We're not in control of how the scrolls were stored. We do not know how much water leaked in and out of each of those caves throughout the 2,000 years of their storage. So to say that there could be contamination of them is not just rational. There's going to be contamination. There has to be contamination. It is insane nonsense to think there's not contamination. It had to be. It spent 2,000 years in a cave. And these caves, they've changed their shapes, they've worn, they've eroded. That means the water's coming and going. In fact, most of these caves are right at the base of the waterline. So there's no way that you can claim that these are all in pristine condition. That's the problem. If they were in pristine condition, then the carbon dating would be more useful, more reliable, to a degree. Again, it's still going to give you an age range. And that's not, if the age range for the second sigma distribution is between 200 BCE to 100 AD. Well, that age range is not going to help you settle the dispute on whether or not the scrolls are Seleucid environment enemies or Roman enemies, because the earlier date you got Seleucids, the later date you got the Romans. It's not going to help you determine who the teacher of righteousness was, or there was a series of these teachers, who each individual one was. Who was it from the time of the Maccabees, or is it the time of Jesus? Well, you can't determine it with the carbon-14 date. It could be either one. Either one's perfectly valid within the carbon-14 framework. So it's not determinative, which means it doesn't help you. There's another factor. Ossuaries have been analyzed. The ossuaries were also stored in Qumran-type caves and in tombs. And ossuary studies have shown that each individual cave has its own biochemistry, and that the distinctive chemical signatures of each cave can be traced on each ossuary. When you look at the patina on the ossuaries and you analyze it biochemically, say how much iodine, how much sulfur, how much iron, how much et cetera, all the different minerals that they might find in the patina. And it's like a chemical fingerprint when you look at a graph of how much of the different elements are there. And you hold up that chemical fingerprint to one ossuary and compare it. No, it doesn't match this cave, doesn't match that cave. Oh, it matches this one. So you can find that each cave has its own distinctive biochemical signature for the patina on the ossuaries that have been stored in them. So if this is true for patina variation, why wouldn't it also be true for carbon-14 infiltration or exfiltration at wear and tear on the scrolls? If there can be variability in patinas from one cave to another, then there can be variability in carbon leaching from one cave to another. In fact, I'm going to quote Erka Heides from Radiocarbon Dating and its application to quaternary studies in the Eisenstaedtler und Gegenwart Quaternary Science Journal, Hanover, 2008. It's volume 57. So the process of exchange of carbon might lead to contamination with either young or old carbon. That's an important factor. How do you determine whether there's been contamination of young or old carbon? And that has not been addressed in the scroll studies at all. Not at all. Which means it's wide open. You just simply, if you have a problem with the carbon-14 date, you have every right to say, well, it could be that it's been fudged by Mother Nature and we've been tricked. It's a carbon-14 date that gives us an artificial age because we didn't take into account the storage conditions during the entire time. And we have to know the storage conditions of the entire 2,000 years. And we don't. We can't be sure of that. And because we don't have that certainty, we cannot pound the table and say the carbon-14 date rules out this theory or that theory. It doesn't. It can't. It's not capable of it. It does not have that kind of definite certainty. Another quote, radiocarbon agents cannot provide absolutely dated chronologies for archaeological or paleoenvironmental studies directly, but must be converted to calendar age equivalents using a calibration curve compensating for fluctuations in atmospheric carbon-14 concentration. That's Paula Reamer et al. Intercal Northern Hemisphere Radiocarbon Age Calibration Curve is from the periodical Radiocarbon, volume 62, the issue 4, special one, an Intercal 20 calibration issue. That's from August of 2020. So the limestone, the Qumran caves are limestone, pure calcium carbonate, and they're marl. It's the softest of the limestone. The softer the stone is, the easier it is for contamination to occur. Harder stone, less contamination, less erosion. But softer stone, easy as can be. Plus, you have residents, non-human residents in the caves, mice and rats. They find a cave with leather in it. They eat it up and leave all kinds of waste products, etc. Meanwhile, they're drinking the calcium carbonated water and dumping ancient carbon deposits into the cave as well. There's just no way that we can say we've known the storage conditions for the schools all the way through. So bottom line, serious scholars who really want to know what the scrolls say and what they teach are admitting look at the internal data to find the dating of the scrolls. Robert Eisenman dates the scrolls to the 1st century CE on the basis of his interpretations of the scrolls. He sees James the Just, James the brother of Jesus, as the author of 4QMMT. Other scholars, such as Barbara Thiering, who I disagree with her identification of who the wicked priest is, etc. But I agree with her dating of the scrolls, that the scrolls do apply to the 1st century CE and to the time of Jesus, and including Jesus. Other scholars, such as Cecil Roth, G.R. Driver, they've looked at the scrolls and said, well, this sounds like the Zealots from the 1st century. Others, like DuPont Summer and Yagil Yadin, have looked at the war scroll and determined that this matches the 1st century Roman military manuals. Others, like Norman Gold, said, and I disagree, he won't agree with which sect is represented by the Dead Sea Scroll community. He won't agree with me on that, but he will agree that these scrolls were all hidden in a hurry just before the war in 70 CE. I guess you can say a lot of scholars for that. Basically, the whole scholarly community agrees these scrolls were hidden just before the war. So it makes sense to think that the scrolls would be dealing with topics just before the war. It seems patently absurd to think that they'd be hiding all their most sacred scrolls and not put any in from the time that they were living in. Just that's absurd on the face of it, in my opinion. So that's a summary of it for the dating of the scrolls. On carbon-14, carbon-14 is simply too vague to be specific enough to help us in the Qumran identification of scrolls and for sectarian issues. And it's too unreliable because the scrolls have not been kept in pristine condition. You need a pristine sample to do a proper carbon-14 analysis, and that's not what we have here. So we can't treat it and pretend that it is. And that's it. Summary. That's our show, Jacob. A short one.
How do you respond to academics that say, we know for a fact the Dead Sea Scrolls never mentions nor alludes to the historical Jesus, and that they are solidly dated to the BCE chronology of the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE?
Well, they're not solidly dated because the dead. Like I said, first of all, it's a range for carbon-14, and the only other claims for dating are claims that are made by a notoriously biased group called the International Team. They were the ones who were saying the 2nd century BCE, DeVoe and others, Millet. These were all claiming the scrolls were too old. They had a bias. They wanted to make sure that the scrolls were not tied to Jesus. They had a definite agenda. In fact, for 40 years, they didn't let other scholars even look at the scrolls. They had their copies. You want to know about the scrolls? You ask me. I've got the scrolls. You can't see it. They're mine. That was the Roman Catholic attitude towards it, because they controlled the Rockefeller Museum where the scrolls were stored, and they maintained that control very, very strong, and refused to publish the scrolls or even copies of the scrolls or photographs of the scrolls so other scholars could double check their work and see, are you being fair with this? And it turns out, when we've looked at their work and double checked their work, they have not been fair. And then they've gone out of their way to obfuscate the scroll information. Just give an example. Here's a book, The Dead Sea Scrolls Translated. Now, the translator here, Martinez, is a Catholic, and he goes out of his way to take terms that were theological terms that were in common between the Dead Sea Scroll community and the early Christian church, and he makes sure that he translates them in a way that you don't see the commonality. So, for example, Paul was sent to go and search for the followers of Jesus, and they were identified as followers of the way. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls talk about walkers in the way. But do you think that he'll translate it as walkers in the way? No. Followers of the path, or walkers on the road, or anything but the way. And then he doesn't translate them the same way twice. So it's the road this time, the path the next time. It's so that you don't see that you don't see in English that the same word is being used consistently. I really prefer the translations done by Robert Eisenman and the Eisenman and Wise combinations, because they consistently use the same word in translating the same word when they find it. So they find the word hodos in Greek or the word derek in Hebrew, which is for road or way, then they're going to translate it the same way all the way along. So you get an idea that they were being used as technical terms. And the Catholic Church has obfuscated the scrolls all the way through intentionally, absolutely intentionally. And that should give you a clue right there. In the meantime, the only non-Catholic on the school team was John Allegro. And John Allegro the whole time was saying, when the truth about the scrolls gets out, the Catholic Church is going to fold up and quit doing business because it's going to just debunk them so badly. So the scrolls are not all 2nd century BCE. Some of them are, especially a lot of the biblical texts, which you would expect. And one must also remember that Cave 4 was a Gnitze, which means it had been used for getting rid of old scrolls for quite some time before the rest of the scrolls were hidden there. So yes, you do expect to have some older copies of scrolls, especially in Cave 4. But the scrolls that are most relevant to our studies on the historical Jesus are the commentary scrolls, the commentaries on the Old Testament text. And it's not the texts themselves that they're commenting on that's so intriguing, but rather their interpretations of what they say the text means, because usually they interpreted each of these texts to tell us some part of their sectarian history. So they'll read in Zechariah, the wicked encompasses the righteous, and they'll say this means when the wicked priest encompassed the righteous teacher at the time of his exile, things like that, as an example of how they interpret the scrolls. So when they get to its interpretation is, and they go on, that's the part where they give us the history of their sect, and that's the genuine history. And it's these pesherim, that's the word for commentaries, these pesherim that give us the sectarian history and give us the clues that they are from the time of Jesus, and they make sense. Furthermore, the scrolls have 1st century information that you don't see before the 1st century, such as talking about the delay of the Parousia. Why isn't Jesus back yet? Why, they don't say Jesus, but why the teachers, they expect him to come. Their teacher, why isn't he back yet? The delay. And they say, well, if it delays, wait for it. Just keep waiting, it's coming. So they talk about that in the scrolls. That's 1st century. That's indicative of 1st century waiting. The scrolls use parables. The parable of the sower of good seed, the parable of rivers of living water, a fountain of living water within you. These are all parables found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that match the Jesus parables. And parables were not thought to have even been 1st century. Some people used to criticize, higher critical scholars used to criticize the New Testament, saying it couldn't be 1st century. The New Testament had to be written later because it's got parables in it, and parables are after the rabbinic period, and you didn't see parable use before the rabbinic period. Well, now we know that parables do go back to the time of Jesus, but if we wanted to say the Dead Sea Scrolls are 2nd century BCE, now we're going to go 2 more centuries back for parables when they were uncomfortable going 1 century back. Now you want to go 3, because you're going to go 2 more. I think you're stretching it to do that. So my answer to that is the internal evidence in the scrolls tells me different, and I'll trust the scrolls over modern opinion. That's all. I'm just going to use the information from the scrolls as I best see it, and that's all anybody can do. All right.
Before we close, I'd like to ask you to briefly recap some of the parallels that you think are most striking between the biblical Jesus and the teacher righteousness. And also, another question I'd like to add to that is, do we have any text that refers to Judas the Galilean as being a king?
Yes. Josephus said that Judah the Galilean had royal pretensions. That qualifies. And tell you what, I'm going to read one of the scrolls, one portion of the scroll, and the viewers can determine for themselves where they think it sounds like it could be a character similar to Jesus. This is from 1 Quixote. This is from the Cave 1, the habitational cave. And this passage was clearly written by the teacher of righteousness himself. I suggest to the viewers that what we're about to hear are the words of the historical Jesus. If not the historical Jesus, then one of his brothers who took over after he died. It's one of the series of righteous teachers could be Jesus himself. Quote, "They said of the vision of knowledge, it is not certain, and the path of your heart, it is not that. But you, O God, will answer them, judging them with your power, according to their idols and their numerous sins, so that in their schemes are cut those who deviate from your covenant. At the judgment, you will annihilate all the men of deception. There will no longer exist seers of delusion, for they do not value me. Even though you exhibit your power in me and reveal yourself in me with your strength to enlighten them, you have not covered in disgrace the face of all those looking for me. Those who unite together for your covenant, those who walk on the path of your heart, have listened to me. They have aligned themselves with you in the council of the holy ones. Through me, you have enlightened the face of the many. You have increased them, even making them uncountable, for you have shown me your wondrous mysteries." Who is that guy? If it's not Jesus, who is it? If that's not Jesus, who is it? Someone who thinks he's a lot like Jesus. That's all I can say. So that's one example. You want commonalities between Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm trying to think of a good summary listing of them that I've got. And I will be giving you a good list of that in a moment. Well, let's just wing it and go through, pull it out of my head then instead of relist it. Strict rules on marriage. You don't get divorced. Opposition to King Herod. We know they opposed King Herod because one of the rules was the king had to be pure Jewish blood on both sides. Herod was neither. Herod was half Idumean and half tribe of Benjamin on the other side. The king was never to get divorced. The king was never to marry his cousin. Herod married his cousin, divorced that cousin, and married another cousin. So not going to be too popular with the Dead Sea Scroll community. So strict rules on marriage, opposition to Herod, use of the term Holy Spirit, Ruach Kodesh. It's a term not used even once in the whole Old Testament, but yet it's used hundreds of times in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You might find it maybe half a dozen times in all of extant Jewish literature. Maybe half a dozen times in all of it. Search all high and low. I've had a lot of Jewish friends do so. They couldn't even come up with a full half dozen examples. Very rare phrase. Yet it's hundreds of times represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This tells me that we've identified the correct sect. Another thing, they kept all things in common. That's distinctive. That's something you can use to identify. There's no mention of more than one sect doing that. You never heard of a sectarian who's totally dependent on the sect. His laundry's done by the sect. His food's provided by the sect. Everything he has, all his wealth has been given to that sect. So he's got nothing to rely on except that sect. And you don't find him knocking at the wrong door and someone says, "You're not part of our sect. You're in the wrong commune." Apparently, there was only one sect that held all things in common. So if the Dead Sea Scrolls sect held all things in common, and then Jesus tells us that they held all things in common, well, then we know what sect he was in. It makes sense. One more thing, completely a match. The idea that everything would wrap up within one generation. Jesus said, "There are some standing here who will not see death until all these things are fulfilled." That's in Mark. The Dead Sea Scroll community expected everything to wrap up within one generation. And they even used the same definition for a generation. They called it a 40-year period. So sometimes they would refer as the generation, or sometimes they would say the 40 years, very frequently. So that exactly matches. The timing matches. The Dead Sea Scroll community expected their teacher of righteousness to resurrect 30 years after he died. And they expected that to be in 70 CE, which means he died in 30 CE, exact match to the date of Jesus. The Dead Sea Scroll community said they were wandering like blind men, wandering in the wilderness, groping for the way. God saw they searched for the perfect heart and sent them a teacher of righteousness to show them the way. This 20-year period, I suggest, began with the death of Judah the Galilean in 6 CE, and he founded the sect. So the death of their founder would explain why the sectarians were wandering like blind men at a certain point. So if that is the correct interpretation of it, then 6 CE is the starting point for that 20-year period, and that means the teacher arrived at their sect and began its public teaching in 26 CE. Again, a match for the historical Jesus. So the timing matches for his death. The timing matches for his preaching. The subject matter of his preaching matches. The structure of his sect matches. Everything about it matches. The themes and the theology of the sect matches completely. So I think we've got the right sect. Furthermore, there only were 4 sects to choose from, according to Josephus, or 3. Josephus described the pre-war Judaism into 3 sects. You got the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Then elsewhere, Josephus said, well, there's a little bit more detail. These Essenes, we can actually divide them into 2. There's the Essenes and the Nazarenes as well. The Nazarenes are even more strict, but they allowed women in their group. There's another thing, another commonality. Jesus' group allowed women to follow with them, which is something the Dead Sea Scroll sect allowed them to do. So everything, again, matches their social milieu matches, the inclusion of women, the cultural milieu matches, the timing matches, the theology matches, the organization matches. Everything about it is a complete match that way. So what other sect would we suggest? Would we suggest that Jesus was a Sadducee? No. He was calling the Sadducees hypocrites. And the Sadducees don't believe in angels, and they don't believe in resurrection. The Dead Sea Scroll sect, they believed in angels. They believed in resurrection. Again, another perfect match. So it's not the Sadducees, not the Pharisees. Pharisees are calling them hypocrites. Well, if Jesus was calling the Pharisees hypocrites and he himself was a Pharisee, then Jesus would be a hypocrite. So it's not the Pharisees. So we've eliminated the Sadducees, we've eliminated the Pharisees, and there's only the Essenes and Nazarenes left, and the Essenes didn't allow women. Okay, so we're left with the Nazarenes. And guess what? Jesus is known as a Nazarene. I don't know. I think we might have found the sect. Anyway, it makes sense to me. Does that help?
Yeah, I think it does. Well, thanks for coming on the channel today, Christopher Lawson.
Okay. In a shorter show, our viewers don't have to have their heads break this time. We'll do another longer one next time. How's that?
Yeah, that sounds great. Look forward to it. Thanks again.
Okay. Thanks again.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe
and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.